Welcome to HortTube. My name is Jim Putnam. In this video, we're going to talk about protecting plants from late frost and freezes in the late winter, early spring. This year, we've had a very, very early start. We had a tough freeze around December, and other than that, we haven't had much of a winter at all, and things have really woken up. Not just the non-natives, even the native plants have been fooled by this year. And, we're sitting here trying to figure out over the next week or so. Like last night, we had a predicted low of 35, and we actually have some spotty frost out here in the garden. So it dropped down to 32 in a couple little places in the garden, and the top of the cars have some frost on them. I use the WeatherBug app on my phone, and it has dozens of locations in the around the city of Raleigh. The temperatures at various elementary schools, middle schools, high schools, that kind of thing. And you can open that up and look at all locations, and it's everything from 31 to 39 degrees across the whole area. So one thing you'll learn about your own garden is you'll have places that are more vulnerable to frost. And that's the important part about thinking about what you might protect or not protect. Our back garden back here, the back of the house has a wooded area behind it. And I've noticed that we get very little frost on plants back there. It seems to stay a degree or two warmer. Out here in the more open front garden is where I see more frost when we have those nights that are predicted 35, 34, 33. They're slightly above freezing. It seems to drop to 32 out here in this front garden, and the back garden, it stays a little bit higher. So here, because so many things have jumped out ahead, we're actually just gonna have to make decisions on what's important to us. So this Indian hawthorn right here is incredibly fragrant, vivid pink flowers on it. Just one of our absolute favorite plants here in the garden. We've tree formed it last spring. It got some frost on it at the last minute, and we lost the flowers on it. This year, I'd like to get it protected. I'd like to make sure we're covering this one and protecting it. Some of the other things in the garden, I'm just gonna have to let nature take its course. Most things will be unharmed by it, but it will stunt them or set them back some potentially. One of the things to always remember in gardening is water is a great insulator. And so if it's slightly dry in your area, you may want to water your plants a day before a potential frost or a heavy freeze. And freeze is more what we're worried about here. The frost, when you get these minor frost where there's just a little bit of ice on the leaves, that can affect the most tender growth on some of your new plants, set them back just a bit. Most plants will just immediately restart. A freeze, something that's 28 degrees and is sustained for 4 or 5 hours can really hurt open flowers and really set back any growth you have on your spring flowering things, fruit especially. So those things I'm definitely going to want to water. And then, that I really am concerned about. So I'll water that Indian hawthorn back there, and then we'll throw some sort of cover over it. You have lots of options for covers. The main thing to keep in mind though is don't destroy the plant trying to protect it. So, this is a painter's cloth here, and I will use it, but I'll use it on a very sturdy plant. It's just a much heavier cloth than other things. If I put this on daffodils, I'm just gonna crush the daffodils to the ground, and what good will that have done me? Great, the daffodils are, the flowers are alive, but they're laying on the ground. We'll use various plastics. So, this tarp, you can use clear plastic, be careful with it because it will, if the sun comes up on it the next morning, it can really cook underneath it. So again, just plastics in general. We typically won't put covers on things until late in the afternoon, and then we'll recheck them about 9 o'clock at night, because if you get any kind of breeze at all, any of these things can blow off or blow over, or animal knock it over, whatever. I got heavy cloths. We've got plastic. We've got shade cloths. This is a shade cloth that you typically see over a greenhouse to keep a greenhouse a few degrees cooler. They work great for frost protection. We have tons of sheets, tons of towels. Here's another frost protection cloth, and I have a giant frost protection blanket that I'll use for that Indian hawthorn. For us, this season has just, again, started so quickly that we're gonna have to make decisions on what's important and what's not important. Some of these flowering things are gonna get knocked back. If we have a night in the upper 20s, I think on our forecast right now we have 33 on Saturday night upcoming, and that potentially will be 31, 32, similar to what last night was out there in that front garden space. And I'll cover a couple of things. Further out in the forecast, though, there's nights in the 20s, and those are the ones that are actually concerning to me, because that's going to be some period of time, a few hours, it's going to actually be below freezing. The air temperature is going to be below freezing. I mentioned daffodils out there with the cover. They're not one I'm actually worried about. They're pretty daggone tough. We've got pansies out here, pretty daggone tough. These super, super early things that are kind of on time, tulips and daffodils and hyacinths and the pansies and that kind of thing, they're pretty tough. I mean, I'm not gonna go out of my way to protect any of those things. But what we do have are things like this garden phlox right here that has decided that it's spring, and it's up, and it's up, 3 or 4 inches. I don't think a freeze would come along and knock this thing back to the ground, but wouldn't kill it. It would come back out, but I don't really want to have it. I really don't want to have to go through an entire reset with it if I don't have to. So it's easy for me to come over here, take a 1 gallon container, and this is true of any of your perennials that are popping out of the ground already. I can take a 1 gallon container late afternoon on a day that it's going to be potential heavy frost. That's something, if you get temperatures that are predicted in the low 30s, you have, again, you'll learn your garden over time. For us, if the temperature's predicted around 35, which it was last night, it stays like 35 in this back garden, and I don't really get any frost. But out there in the front, for some reason, drops a few degrees cooler. I see frost on the cars, I see frost on the plants. And so, you can learn that about your garden. My nursery had this. I had the place where we parked our cars, I kind of gave up growing plants there because it was just always several degrees colder there on any given night, and I would have more damage in that area than other areas of the nursery. So we just turned it into the spot where the trucks and the cars went. But again, any of my tender perennials that are waking up, especially your marginal perennials. And so if you've got perennials that are barely hardy in your area, like a salvia that's only hardy in zone 7 to 10 and you're in zone 7, and that thing's up this much already, that's something you're probably going to want to take a container and throw it over, take a towel and throw over it, something overnight, and then get it off when it comes back above 32 degrees the next day. We leave our leaves in place and we haven't mulched yet. So I have this advantage where I could come out here and just take leaves from one area and just put them right over top of this salvia that's coming up right here. That would be completely adequate to protect that plant. I can water it if I thought it needed, if the soil wasn't moist, and then throw my leaves over it. Completely adequate. We've got things flowering a month ahead of schedule. All of the hydrangeas leafing out, butterfly bushes waking up. I mean, it just doesn't matter what it is. And so again, it's a matter of going through here and selecting what's important to us. If it's a short-term spring flowering thing, like that loropetalum here, the red loropetalum, I mean, that's, it was only going to bloom a couple weeks anyway. I'm definitely not going to waste a whole lot of effort on it. I'd rather save a perennial that is going to get knocked completely to the ground and take a month and a half to come back from it, or potentially die. So I'm more worried about that. That shrub will very quickly, in some cases, just put on it's like a free pruning almost. It will shorten the length of time it's going to flower if it's in the 20s for several hours, for sure. My osmanthus here, which is, got some typical late winter, early spring flowers on it and smelling fantastic. A lot of this new tender growth that's on it's likely going to get frozen back again. Almost like a free pruning. I don't see myself worrying about that little bit of new growth on it. It's an established plant, so it's not really going to hurt it. If I had a very small version of this and it was completely covered in new growth, and it was going to be in the mid-20s, that might be a plant that I might think about covering. The maturity of this plant, the fact that it's 8 feet tall, it's got very sturdy wood, it's just going to burn the tips of the new foliage, and it's going to just leaf right back out. It might set it back a month, but no big deal. One other thing when you're thinking about plants to protect, the plants that got damaged back in the December freeze event, those plants, if they've started to leaf back out again, those might be things that you want to prioritize. the damage that they took, having leafed out and then that gets burned off. Can they do it a second time? Who knows? So again, I'm looking for some of those plants that got damaged, have worked their way through that and started to leaf out again, maybe about to bloom again. I'm gonna protect those and make sure they don't get doubled down on from that December freeze. The other thing that may be going on is you've put out seed, you've direct seeded some things out in the garden. Any very new seedling is gonna be very vulnerable to a freeze. Once it has, maybe if it even, cool season things, needs some height on them and some size on them before, they can take really, very, very cold temperatures like that. So if you have brand new seedlings, might want to think about throwing some sort of light cloth over them or building some sort of structure over them where there's something, heavy's not laying on them. There are things like peonies that are up, and they're up about this high, and I may have a container that's big enough to cover them, but it's one of those things I don't throw sheets over because they're just so kind of, I can end up doing more damage to them. And so those are something I'd either build something over the top of, or hopefully maybe you can lightly bend them a bit and then put a container over them. Just being careful not to do more damage again than the cold was gonna do. Cardboard boxes make great covers for perennials that have popped up out of the ground. So, we've got a few of these, just happen to have a few things, that we got in the mail in the last few days. So we'll use those. We jump started a bunch of our tropical-ish things out here in a video a week or two ago. So things like elephant ears and Asian lilies and other things, they're starting to come up some. The reason that we did them in containers like this is so we could move the containers in the house. And so any of our we haven't jumped started and put things in the ground too early. We've left them in containers. So these things will just go in the house for the evening. Again, these early flowering shrubs that were only going to flower for a couple of weeks anyway, I don't know that I'm going to go out of my way. This white loropetalum is quite beautiful, but if I was prioritizing, again, some perennial that's going to flower all summer long, getting damaged versus, the shrub that's just going to get knocked back a bit and then restart, I'm probably going to prioritize the perennials, honestly. So normally I do one of these videos this time of year when we're going to have, like always, our average last frost date here is April 15th, and it's before March 15th. Of course, we were going to get some at least threat of cold weather. And normally I do one of these videos and say, there's a few things here or there that I might think about covering, but overall, it's just completely normal for plants to get frost on them between March 15th and April 15th. What's very different about this particular season is it may happen multiple times and everything is waking up. And I mean, truly across the board, almost everything has some sign of new growth on it. And so again, this is going to be about prioritizing. The things that are mobile, your containers, if it's something that you're concerned about, obviously that can go inside, it can go in a garage. I've got a cotoneaster here and a boxwood. Boxwood has some new growth on it. It's not going to hurt a boxwood. Conifers are something I'm just not going to worry about. They're supposed to be growing right now anyway. They grow, typically your conifers are growing during cool parts of the year, and they're not going to be hurt unless it's a very marginal one in your area. So for most of this, I do have a Dracaena back here that might go in, in upper 20s. This Dianella is kind of marginal in our area, so it might get toted up here on the porch. But again, I'm just kind of going through and figuring that out and do that earlier on so that you're not scrambling when it happens. Save your boxes. Containers, we save a lot of containers, and so especially 15 and 25 gallon containers. We just have a stack of them behind the shed back there that we can break out when this happens, and these little perennials are so easy to cover with those containers. So I think that this coming Saturday for us, and again, I'm in Raleigh, North Carolina, so I don't know what it's, you have to look out on your forecast. Anything that's between a temperature of 32 to 36, we're going to have potential frost out here in this front garden. It's going to fall to 32 in certain pockets out there, and there might be a couple things I cover. Anything that's predicted below 32, especially like upper 20s, because that means it's going to be below freezing for 4 or 5 hours, that's when I'm going to break out the heavier covers, and I'm going to prioritize the perennials that are popping out of the ground, especially any marginal ones, the ones that are barely hardy here. Again, lots of salvias are a great example of that. And then prioritize a few shrubs that are extremely important, where I started out there with that Indian hawthorn. I just love the flowers on that plant. The rest of these short-term flowering, early flowering shrubs, they're pretty tough plants in general, these things that flower this early. But if they get a little bit of damage on them, I'm just not that concerned about it. It was a very short window anyway. I'd rather worry about what was happening 2 or 3 weeks from now than worry about, necessarily an open flower today. So there you go. That's our thoughts and process, thinking about how, again, I knew we were very, very set up for this. It has been extremely warm, and we've had days in the 80s, several days in the 80s at this point, and the plants have, regardless of native and non-native, a lot of times it's the non-natives that wake up early and you go, well, it wasn't from here, it didn't know. But this year we even have all the native plants participating in the early wake up. So again, good luck with any frost or freezes you have this spring, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel, and we'll show you lots of things going into this garden this spring. Thanks for watching.